Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the true hidden history of the Greek goddess Hera. And look, if you think you already know the Queen of Olympus, well, you might want to buckle up. We're about to completely shatter that perspective using the actual archaeological record.
Let's just dive right in. When you hear the name Hera, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably the endlessly jealous Queen of Olympus, right? Constantly throwing tantrums over Zeus and his many affairs. We've literally been taught to see this deity defined entirely by her marriage. But her actual history, it's so much older and honestly, so much more powerful than those dramatic soap opera myths would have us believe.
To really get how distorted our modern view is, you have to look at what scholars like Walter Burkert have pointed out. He notes that the sort of harsh, nagging wife, the termagant of Homer and the myths, is, quote, an almost comic figure. Literary giants like Homer purposefully painted her as petty and subordinate. But the thing is, that literary version completely contradicts the massive, awe-inspiring reality of her historical cult following.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Queen of Olympus, the literary tropes.
So this is the trope we're definitely the most familiar with, the sister and wife of Zeus. In classical mythology, they completely domesticated her domain. She was the patron goddess of lawful marriage, usually shown holding a pomegranate to symbolize immortality. People worshipped her as Hera Teleia, literally the fulfiller of marriage. But here's the catch. This domestic sphere, it is just a tiny fraction of her true identity.
Let's move on to Section 2, more than a wife, a web of epithets. If you peel back the layers of her worship, you find a fiercely independent goddess. And we can actually prove this by looking at the titles, the epithets her ancient worshippers used. We see Teleia for marriage, sure, that's there, but then look at the earth category. We have Buopus, which means cow-eyed. That directly links her to primal fertility magic, and most surprisingly, Hoplosmia. That literally translates to bearing arms or a shield. Clearly, this is not a goddess who just sits at home waiting for her husband.
Actually, in places like Elise and Samos, she had this incredibly distinct, warlike, almost terrifying character. Get this, she was called Alexandros, the protector of men, Tropaia, the giver of victory. The poet Lycophron even records her as Dias, which means the bringer of destruction. The big takeaway here is that Hera was absolutely a martial force to be reckoned with. She was actively safeguarding citadels and granting military triumphs.
Section 3, uncovering ancient origins, tracing Hera back in time.
So you gotta ask, if she wasn't originally just Zeus's wife, where exactly did this multifaceted deity come from? Well, if we trace her worship back, we hit Mycenaean Linear B tablets from the 1400s BCE. Right there, she is recorded as Hera. This is way before the Olympian pantheon was ever established in literature. Fast forward to the 8th century BCE, and she's commanding these massive architectural projects. And by the Hellenistic period, her profound influence synchronizes her with incredibly powerful Near Eastern mother deities. That Near Eastern connection is just fascinating. Her common Homeric title, Buopus, or cow-eyed, strongly links her to older, primal cow goddesses like Hathor. You see, in the ancient world, combining feminine divinity, the cow, and the moon was basically the ultimate hallmark of fertility magic. Long before she was ever cast as a Greek bride, she was this primal Mediterranean goddess of nature.
Section 4, the earliest monumental temples, outshining Zeus.
Now, if you want physical, undeniable proof of her immense historical power, you really just have to look at the architecture. The stones literally speak volumes that the myths try to hide. While the stories cast her as this subordinate spouse, the historical reality on the ground is that her monuments were larger, older, and way grander than those of Zeus. Back in the 8th century BCE, the very earliest monumental enclosed roofed temples in all of Greece were dedicated to Hera. Not the king of the gods, Hera. 155. That's a huge number. That is the exact number of columns in the massive Polycrotian temple built for her at Samos around 540 BCE. I mean, it was literally a forest of stone. And if you go to the local museum today, it's packed with offerings from pilgrims who traveled from as far away as Armenia, Babylon, and Egypt just to honor her. The myths might try to say she was unpopular, but her ancient PR speaks for itself, right? She was an international powerhouse. And here is perhaps the ultimate archaeological plot twist. Think about Olympia. It is the famous ultimate sanctuary of Zeus, home of the Olympic Games. But even there,
Hera's temple and her revered seated cult figure were established before his. No way around it. She wasn't some afterthought. In the world of monumental Greek worship, she was there first.
Section 5. The Three Faces of Hera. Maiden, Mother, Widow.
Moving beyond the temples, her ancient rituals are incredibly telling. They acted as etiological myths, essentially origin stories that map deeply onto agricultural and seasonal cycles, not domestic disputes. Take Stymphalus, for example. There, she was worshipped in this distinct triple aspect. Pais, the maiden, Teleia, the fulfilled adult woman or mother, and Hera, the separated or widowed. Scholars think this likely symbolized her arrival in spring, the summer harvest, and her departure in winter. It paints her as a standalone earth deity controlling the seasons, totally independent of her relationship with Zeus.
Her festivals were also steeped in this intense primal magic. At Samos, they had this peculiar festival called the Toneia. The sequence is fascinating. First, they'd take her ancient wooden image, purify it at the sea, bind it tightly in willow branches, and then actually hide it for the participants to discover. This wasn't about a marriage at all. It was a potent fertility ritual, completely mirroring the seasonal disappearance and retrieval of the earth goddess herself.
We see something similar in Plataea with the incredible Daedala Fire Festival. Now, local myth claimed Hera ran away from Zeus and he tricked her into coming back with a fake wedding. But that literary myth is clearly just a cover for a much older primal ritual. In reality, worshippers bathed a wooden puppet of the goddess, placed it on a cow-drawn cart, and then ritually burned it on Mount Cithaeron to renew the earth. This wasn't a jealous wife. This was a goddess of profound, transformative fire magic. All of this rich history leads us to one final, really provocative question. If a goddess had temples older than Zeus, an international cult following, and an identity spanning from a fierce, shield-bearing warrior to a life-giving Earth Mother, why on earth do we only remember the jealous wife? It really goes to show you how later literature can just entirely rewrite the history of powerful figures. So the next time you hear a myth about Hera throwing a tantrum, remember the 155 columns at Samos and the fierce protector who stood tall long before Olympus was ever written down. Thanks for joining this explainer.